Thank you, Sierra. And we're so excited that you're all here today for this conversation. And I promise you a great conversation it will be. Since the beginning of the launch of the campaign, we have recognized the importance of monitoring and navigating the policy landscape that impacts students, their families, schools, and the communities that they live in. Early grade retention has been debated for many years as part of this policy landscape. Early this year, in June, I believe, we examined early grade retention with a focus on adult accountability. And in December of 2021, we looked at the policy landscape in light of the pandemic. So this is an ongoing conversation that we have been having with you all. As we know, there have been some mixed results with the implementation of retention policies, and some states have reversed legislation mandating retention, including my own state, Iowa, where I live. But what remains clear is that regardless of the policies that mandate retention, teacher preparedness, high quality curriculum for all students, and more intensive supports for struggling readers are fundamental to addressing learning recovery. In today's webinar, our panel of research and policy leaders will engage in a conversation about the risks and benefits of early grade retention and what the national policy landscape shows. Our panelists today, if we can go to the next slide, Sierra, include Adrienne Fisher, who is a senior policy analyst with the Education Commission of the States, David Griffith, associate director of research for the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, Kristen Hengen, a senior analyst with the Education Trust, and Casey Sullivan-Taylor, policy director of early literacy for ExcelinEd. A distinguished panel they are. And now it's my pleasure to welcome our moderator for today, Dr. Naishawana Francis Thompson, who is the Chief of Curriculum and Instruction for the School District of Philadelphia. Dr. Nye, thank you for joining us and welcome. We are so pleased you could be here today.
Thank you, Becky, for that warm introduction. Again, my name is Dr. Naishawana Francis Thompson. Currently, I am the Chief of Curriculum and Instruction in the School District of Philadelphia. I'm excited to join this conversation today as the moderator on early grade retention, a conversation about potential benefits and risks. And this conversation is a part of the Learning Loss Recovery series. I also want to share that not only do I approach this conversation as Chief of Curriculum and Instruction here in the School District of Philadelphia, I also have a background in special education, multi-tiered systems of supports where I've done significant research in that area as well. But most importantly, I approach this conversation as a mom of an 8-year-old striving reader who also experienced pandemic learning. And I want to be able to hear this conversation and provide some insight as well from that perspective as a parent. So without further ado, I'm going to proceed with our panelists. First, I want each panelist to tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization. First up, we have Adrienne.
Thanks, Dr. Nye, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Becky and Sierra and the CGLR team for putting on this event and inviting us to participate. My name is Adrienne Fisher, and I'm a senior policy analyst at Education Commission of the States, where I focus mainly on early care and education from preschool through 3rd grade. For those of you who aren't familiar with ECS, we're a nonpartisan policy organization covering education policy topics across the spectrum from early care and education all the way through post-secondary and the workforce. And we provide this through unbiased information through reports and analysis like the one I'll be citing later in this panel, as well as through virtual and in-person convenings where policymakers can learn from one another. And I will pass it along to Kristen.
Thanks, Adrienne. Hi, everyone. My name is Kristen Hengen. I'm a senior policy analyst with the Education Trust, and I lead our work on college and career readiness. The Education Trust is an advocacy organization. I'm in our DC office, but we also have deep partnerships and folks on the ground in about a dozen states. And our organizational goal is to advocate for high quality education and outcomes for specifically students of color and students from low-income backgrounds. So really happy to be on the call, and I'll pass it to Casey.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'm happy to be here with you, and I thank you all for joining us today. My name is Casey Sullivan-Taylor. I serve as the Policy Director of Early Literacy at ExcelinEd. ExcelinEd, we like to call it a think and a do tank. We certainly work on policy, but we also work with states on implementation of policy and support state agencies as they strive to implement policies that are passed at the legislative level. We believe that education policy is an opportunity and it can improve outcomes for students. In my prior roles, I've been a teacher, an interventionist for reading. I've been a literacy coach, and I served at the Mississippi Department of Education at the beginning of the enactment of their literacy law, and left there in 2019 and served at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction prior to joining ExcelinEd. And we're excited about this conversation today, and I look forward to engaging with my colleagues.
David? Unmute.
Hi, everyone. I'm David Griffith. I'm the Associate Research Director with the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. We are a K-12 education think tank in Washington, D.C. We focus on many issues, and this is one of them. And I'm here primarily because we recently put out a brief that's part of our Think Again series that sort of attempted to summarize the changing research landscape around this issue. So it's an honor to be here.
Thank you, everyone, for your introductions. We're going to jump right into the conversation with our first question. Early grade retention. What does the research tell us about this practice? I'm going to start with David. So from your research, what does it tell us about early grade retention?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, let me just clarify, it is not my research. It is the research of many other people. And it's been building up over a number of decades. It is a complicated literature, so I'm going to speak at a very high level. I think the first thing just to understand, and I'm probably telling people things that they know, right? But there is a basic distinction that needs to be made between discretionary retention and mandatory retention. And so by discretionary retention, I mean kind of old school retention where a group of concerned adults, probably including teachers, parents, administrators, maybe a counselor or two, come together and make a decision to retain a student on, I guess you'll say, call it an ad hoc basis. There have been many studies of discretionary retention, but I think the thing that is important to understand for the purposes of this conversation is that by sort of modern social science standards, they're all considered correlational, which is to say they don't really pass the smell test. And that's for a pretty simple reason, right? If it's ad hoc, then retention isn't randomly assigned. And so for obvious reasons, when you compare retained kids to kids who aren't retained, of course, the kids who are retained look worse, but that doesn't necessarily mean that retention hurt them. It just means that there's a lot else that's going on. So in the last couple of decades, as I'm sure most of you know, there has been a movement towards mandatory retention. This is different as a policy, right? It usually involves some sort of test score cutoff that theoretically means that kids are retained if they fall below it. And because of this cutoff, it's easier to study, or it can be more credibly studied. You can do something called a regression discontinuity design that basically means you are comparing kids just above the threshold for retention to kids who are just below the threshold for retention. The idea being that on any given day, it's sort of random whether you score a 99 or a 100 on a reading test. And so there's really not much difference between these kids. And if you see a jump or a sort of discontinuity in the outcomes at that point, then you can take that as evidence of a causal effect. And so this literature continues to develop, but at a very high level, it is more positive than the old literature on discretionary retention. There are studies now that find positive effects of early grade retention in at least 5 states, Florida, Indiana, Mississippi, Chicago, New York City. And these studies, I'm speaking at a sort of a high level, but they tend to show positive effects on test scores for retained kids, often through middle school, not necessarily extending all the way into high school and into high school graduation. They also, a sort of smaller group of studies, find some evidence that there's more school connectedness, right? That kids are sort of at a socio-emotional level doing all right when they're retained, again, only in the early grades. And then, but the flip side of that, right, is that the sort of mandatory retention literature for higher grades remains quite negative. And so there's really no evidence that kids who are retained in 6th grade or 8th grade are benefiting from this. In fact, the outcomes are pretty negative, pretty unambiguously negative. And so, you know, kind of the biggest takeaway that we articulated in our brief was that this should be done earlier if it's done. I think there's a lot more I could say, but I think the only other point that is really important to me that I want to make sure I get in here is I think it is, so far I've talked only about the impacts on kids who are retained, but I think it's really important when we consider the systemic effects of retention to consider the impact, the possibility that there could be spillovers, and in particular positive spillovers. So you can imagine a policy that didn't do much for retained kids. It doesn't help them, doesn't really hurt them, but it could have, you know, could significantly reduce the number of kids who are testing below the sort of desired threshold and, you know, who are ultimately retained. And that's obviously, that's a big win, right? And so it has to be, that possibility, I think, has to be taken seriously and factored into these discussions. At the same time, I'll say there's not a ton of evidence on that. There are only a couple studies that seem to find that, and it's a little harder to study. So in my personal view, I think, you know, the reason we call it Think Again, right, is that, you know, people should reconsider, right? There's real evidence that this can help kids. I think the smart case against early grade retention isn't so much that it's going to hurt kids, it's that there is this sort of pesky issue of fade out, right? And it's a little similar to the pre-K discussion where it does seem to help for a while, but then if it fades out by 8th grade or high school, then, you know, was it really worth it? So I hope we can dig into that, and I'll stop talking now.
Thank you, David, for sharing that research from the Fordham Institute. Becky, I see your hand raised. Is there something you want to share here?
Nope, sorry, I bumped that.
All right, thank you. I will pass it over to Casey. Same question. What does the research tell us about this practice of early grade retention?
Well, I think that David made some great points around the research that is available to us. And I like to be sure and highlight the fact that where we're seeing this positive outcome around retention is in the early grades. And it's also part of a larger comprehensive early literacy package approach. So the policy isn't just about retention alone. It's really much more about focusing on a preventative model so that we have supports that happen for kids beginning in kindergarten and supporting them all the way through to 3rd grade so that we hopefully intervene in a meaningful way and support them to a point that they won't need the retention year. But in the case where retention is used in this sort of a comprehensive early literacy policy package, it's actually another step in intervention to help students get the supports that they need prior to moving on to 4th grade, where teachers are less likely to have had as much training around early literacy foundational skills. And so I think it's important when we think about the supports that these students need, that we recognize that policy policy has to not just focus on retention. Retention is just one part of the picture, and we really have to take a holistic approach to supporting kids. But in those cases, we are seeing outcomes that are more positive and that are demonstrating that this year of retention can be beneficial to students. I believe they're going to pull a slide up for us that's going to highlight a study that's based on the work that I was once a part of in Mississippi, and it has shown us that when students were held back, and David mentioned kind of the approach that they use, so in measuring students who were retained against those who passed just above the threshold that would have just allowed them to move on and promote to 4th grade, when you compare those students, we can see that by 6th grade, those students that were retained had actually been able to show substantial and sustained literacy gains, and their scores in ELA were higher than those who were promoted just above that threshold. Additionally, there were gains that were especially significant among African American and Hispanic students who were examined in this cohort. The other thing is where we often hear that retention is such a bad thing because it will increase absences, increase disciplinary referrals. They did not find results of that from the work that was studied in Mississippi. And additionally, these students didn't appear to experience any other type of negative consequence that might hinder their ongoing academic performance. So we have this study as one of the most recent releases. It was just released this year in 2023. But as David mentioned, there are studies going back across multiple states, and Florida, of course, was the earliest. They implemented their policies in 2002, long before most states. Mississippi began theirs in 2013 was the passing of the law. There was not a group of students retained until the first cohort, which would have been the 2014-2015 school year. So we have seen huge gains, and we'll talk more about those as we progress through the conversation. But in Mississippi, we've seen huge gains, and other states who are implementing this with the preventative measures are also seeing a positive outcome that retention can provide when it's looked at as another year of support and an intervention approach.
Thank you, Casey, for adding on that additional layer to the research around this being a part of a more comprehensive policy to support early literacy. I will now pass it over to Kristen.
Yeah, thank you so much. And the research, so at the Education Trust, we've collected some research on early retention as well. And the research that we found really agrees with a lot of the things in the Fordham Institute's brief and what Casey just mentioned, which is that retention often can happen as a last resort, but what's really important are those extra supports and interventions to ensure students are on grade level or trying to get them up to grade level before the act of retaining. And something else that we find as well, though, we have some different takeaways. So research also shows that Black, Latino, Native students and students from low-income backgrounds are more likely to be retained. And these students are less likely to have consistent access to learning resources and opportunities. And this is an issue because studies also show, we have studies that show that retaining students is correlated with negative social, emotional, and academic outcomes over time. In particular, we're looking at things like students who repeat a grade are more likely to experience bullying or be a bully themselves. So often they may be a different age than students in their grade, right, or have unsupported learning or behavior challenges. We also find that students who are retained may be more likely to have lower self-esteem. And really strikingly, we have research that shows parents of students who are retained are more likely to have lower expectations for their child's academic achievement. And that's something that really stands out to me when we're thinking about having high expectations for all students. And at my organization, we do a lot of research on the importance of belonging. So in a school, in a classroom, student belonging and academic success go hand in hand. So if retention is meaning that students are feeling like they belong or have lower self-esteem, it may make sense that they may develop low self-perceptions, or the adults around them may develop low perceptions of them. And so I think in short, we found that there are a couple of risks that we want to be really wary of, and retention may be only successful with these really strong supports that some states have included and improved learning experiences, right? And to us, if that's the case, what's really helping here? Is it the retention itself, or is it the targeted instructional supports, improved learning experiences, And that's probably where we think it makes sense for districts to invest in.
Thank you, Kristen, for bringing in a very different perspective. And I think that's what we're going to love about this entire conversation is that we get to hear varied perspectives. And one of the things I say in my classroom is that we bring all of those perspectives into the environment to really help us to make very informed decisions. But thank you for adding the social and emotional aspect to this particular strategy and really focusing on the intervention and the improved learning experiences for students that are being impacted by this retention particular strategy. And now I'm going to pass it over to Adrian to add some additional perspective around the research in this area.
Yeah, I'll just briefly, echo some of what's already been said, which is that this is research that's still developing and there's a lot we still don't know. Education policy research, as I'm sure a lot of people on this webinar know, it's inherently difficult to design in a way that can parse out causality, especially when students might be receiving differential interventions based on their retention status. And it's even more difficult to generalize those findings to other states and contexts. But from a policy perspective, I think one way that states can help inform that evolving research is by making data collection and rigorous evaluation part of the policymaking process when retention is implemented, to ensure that policymakers and practitioners have access to that disaggregated data that show how these policies are impacting students. And some states have certainly done that, but others might have a ways to go in being able to really unpack those disaggregated outcomes and impacts.
Thank you, Adrian, for also adding to that discussion and also bringing the larger perspective across all of our states. The next question really goes into policy, and I'm going to start with you, Adrian, but what does policy landscape look like? Where has retention been put in place and what have been those outcomes? So you just shared that map, but we want to hear a little bit more about the policy landscape.
Yeah, if we could bring that slide back up really quick, I'll just walk through some of our findings. So we at ECS recently updated our 50-state comparison on kindergarten through third grade policies, and I'll just walk quickly through the findings for state policies on retention. This map is showing the distribution of how we categorize these policies based on our analysis of state statutes and regulations. 13 states in the District of Columbia are highlighted in purple, with policies that require students to be retained at the end of third grade if certain conditions aren't met. Although states often specify certain good cause exemptions and alternative means of demonstrating satisfactory progress. And 12 states are highlighted in orange, indicating that these states allow for third grade retention, but leave the ultimate decision to local districts, schools, or teachers. And also several states are highlighted in green, and these are states that have approved policy changes that have yet to go into effect. Arkansas will begin requiring retention in the 2025-26 school year, Louisiana beginning in 2024-25, West Virginia in July 2026, and Wisconsin in September 2028. And another change that has yet to go into effect is in Michigan, where the current policy requiring retention will be repealed effective March 2024. But one last thing I want to note is that this analysis is very high level. It gives an idea of what states have in policy, but not the nuance of how those policies are implemented. We know that 2 states can have very similar policies as written in statute, but they may approach good cause exemptions very differently and result in wide variety in the percentage of students who are actually retained under these policies.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm going to pass it over to Casey to add to this discussion.
Thank you. I appreciate Adrian's perspective and just how she highlighted the importance of implementation. A well-written policy is just a place to start. It's a cornerstone to build off of, but implementation makes all the difference. And so I appreciate the attention she drew to that important point. I'm going to talk a little bit about Mississippi and the implementation of retention there as part of a comprehensive early literacy policy package. And so you can see that over the years, Mississippi has made huge progress. And for those of you who join the webinar next week, I'm sure you'll hear more about that. But you can see in fourth grade reading that Mississippi in 2009 was only at around 22% of students who were scoring. And then if you look across the progress in 2019, there was a huge jump. Now, there were increases in between those times. In 2013 to 2015, we did see some growth as well. But in 2019, that was the first year that Mississippi had hit the national average. And it was so unique because Mississippi had previously been at 49th and 50th in fourth grade reading. And so that was a tremendous improvement it drew national attention at that stage, even though we had been making gains prior to that. And of course, then the pandemic hit. And so we had, an inability to really capture NAEP data during that time. But when it was given again in 2022, you can see that there were minimal losses during that time. The regression for Mississippi was much less, and we attribute that to many things, but the sustainability of the overall literacy initiative, which ensured that teachers were trained in the science of reading and how to deliver evidence-based instructional practices within the classroom. The fact that administrators also had access to that training, supports for intervention, screening students to identify them early in kindergarten through third grade, a minimum of 3 times a year. Those students are screened universally in reading, and then there are guidelines for supports when a student is identified to have a reading deficiency. So there are a lot of things in place, but it has all led to growth for Mississippi. And then what we've been so pleased about, and my colleagues who still work in the state of Mississippi are continually striving to create and to maintain that sustainability. And if we look at the next slide, that one actually shows the third grade retention rate over time. Now, I think it's important to note here, you see a change in the graph here, and that's because we started with one threshold of requirement for students. They had to reach the minimal level to move to fourth grade from third grade. But in 2018-19, that school year, that was the year that the proficiency level changed, and students no longer had to score a level 2 out of 5 levels. They then in 2019 and on have to score a level 3 out of 5 levels. So the proficiency level increased. We knew that that would bring about a higher rate of retention that year, but you can see that even with the pandemic and in that following year in 21-22, when retention was reinstated post-pandemic, they are already achieving levels that are lower than pre-pandemic in 2018-19. So Mississippi is one of the states that has been identified as fully recovering from the pandemic, according to an economic analysis that was done. But then the reading scores are also demonstrating that. So I think that that's really important for us to draw attention to, that when we approach retention as part of a comprehensive package, we're putting those supports in place to support students before they fail, that we see positive outcomes from the opportunity to retain kids and provide additional intensive intervention in a second year and third grade.
Thank you again, Casey, for highlighting the preventative approach as well, and making sure that, this is, again, a part of a comprehensive strategy where districts are not just looking at it as just a retention strategy, but a part of a larger comprehensive approach to supporting literacy and early intervention for students before they're requiring that retention. But I'm going to pass it over to Kristen, so share some additional perspective around the policy landscape and what that looks like and where retention has been put in place and what have been some outcomes.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to follow up on a little bit about Michigan, which Adrian highlighted as one of the states that will see a repeal in their retention law next year. And Michigan put in place a retention law in 2016 alongside nearly 24 other states who are putting in laws at the same time. But Michigan this year repealed that retention law. And really, a lot of that came from some important research that came out showing that Michigan's third grade reading retention policy had inequitable impacts. and it was holding back Black and low-income students disproportionately. So there was some research out of Michigan State University that analyzed the effects of the policy and proved something that we hear anecdotally to be true, that often wealthy kids don't get retained because their parents may apply for an exemption or ask the district to bump the students up, not retain them. Whereas students from low-income backgrounds and students of color may not be in a situation where their parents have that advocacy know-how or are engaging with the schools in the same way or have trusted relationships with the schools. So those equity concerns were really important in the conversation around the repeal. And in fact, Black students and students from low-income backgrounds were 5 times more likely to be retained, even when they had the same cut scores as wealthy and white students. So I think that really stood out, and there was a conversation in the state, is holding students back reinforcing achievement gaps and racial inequality and disproportionately impacting low-income communities? If so, that's a concern. Then the retention policy, the state was having a conversation on if it wasn't fair to have this law, but if you're wealthy enough or have a parent with advocacy know-how to get your child promoted, what's the law doing then? So and it was interesting, numerous Michigan superintendents were supportive of this repeal and were sharing that they didn't think the retention law was what was best for their students and their students' outcomes. So, the new law with the repeal requires that parents are notified if their child has poor reading scores that are more than 1 grade level behind. And after being notified, the school is required to provide a reading intervention program by the end of grade 3. And the program includes tools like screening and monitoring at school, at-home reading plans, in-school reading intervention. And it'll be interesting to see what that looks like going forward in the policy landscape. But Michigan is a state that looked at their research, and the research wasn't telling a great story. And I think that speaks to the importance of data, as Adrienne shared, and disaggregated data on which students are being retained and which students are eligible for being retained and which students are actually being retained. And what does that look like?
Kristen, thank you for continuing to center equity in this conversation, particularly focusing on students of color and students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. If you could just highlight, and I'm adding on to this particular question, but as a parent, if you could just highlight 3 things that parents should really be asking their schools when they're in this type of situation, so that they're equipped with the knowledge as well, that would be very helpful here.
That's a great question. I can dig up a resource we have that I'll share in the chat when I have a moment about questions parents can ask their districts, right? Like how is their child doing? And I'll share a little bit more about some research we have on what parents say they want to know from their schools. How is their child doing? What supports do they have access to, right? Including things that they can do at home and things that the school can do. Those are really important questions. If there is a retention policy, what does the appeal process look like? So those are really important questions. And if there's some type of barrier with information, right, the policy may not be applied in the same way to all students.
Thank you, Kristen. And I would add to that, even looking at the assessment data that schools are conducting on their said child to begin to understand what are those areas of supports and needs that their child has in a very proactive way, not waiting for their child to fail, but actually looking at those assessment data and asking the schools, what interventions are you providing to address these particular areas of concern that are showing up, and what resources and supports can we do at home to also support our child or children as they become striving readers with these various areas. But thank you, Kristen. I'm going to pass it over to David. Same question. What does the policy landscape look like? Where has retention been put in place, and what have been the outcomes?
Well, I don't know how much I can add to what everyone said, but I'll say, the map is helpful. And I'll just say my impression is that despite the nuances of the different policies, that many of the policies share some common elements. Nearly all of them have lots of exceptions, right? Because realistically, you have to have exceptions. You can't just keep holding kids back forever. For example, if they're not getting to grade level, you can only do it so many times. You should have some exceptions for kids with IEPs, for ELL kids. I could go on. I guess I also think it's important to highlight. I mean, a related point is that, it's just the point has been made that implementation is important, and it really is. And I think that, depending on how it's implemented, I guess the importance of the policy itself can really be, how many teeth it has, can really be affected. So I just am thinking of one study where it found that 22% of New York City kids were identified, but then 3% were only ultimately retained, right? So that's actually a huge difference. And so I think, we can get into the point about disproportionality. I think it's really interesting and challenging. But I guess the point, in terms of characterizing the landscape, my sense is that a lot of these policies look similar at a very high level, because they've been following this Florida model.
Thank you so much, David. And I'm going to go into the next question. It's actually going to start with you, Kristen. And it's something that we've been talking about throughout the other questions. But how can we mitigate the need for retention?
Yeah, thanks. And I just want to start by painting a picture of resource equity in schools, because in so many schools, we are giving the least to the students who need the most. And then we can't look at each other in third grade and be surprised when especially students of color or students from low-income backgrounds are not performing on tests at the level that we want to see. So we know that these students want to learn and love to read, and we put barrier after barrier in front of them and their families. So at EdTrust, we look at a lot of these barriers that are essential to address if we want to mitigate the need for retention. So for example, from kindergarten, we see students of color and students from low-income backgrounds attending schools with more novice teachers. They attend schools that receive less funding and have fewer resources. These students are less likely to be identified as gifted and talented, which can affect their perceptions of both their educators and themselves. And we just had a report that came out that I can link to that looked at hundreds of books that are used in schools. And we know that when students see themselves reflected in their school curricula, they're more engaged in learning and they can reap academic and social benefits. But students of color rarely see themselves in the books they read for school. And too often when their identities are included, those depictions are negative. So, we also know high quality early learning is associated with better cognitive and social emotional skills, yet it's often inaccessible or unaffordable. And we have research that shows Black and Latino students are not given access to or are served by high quality state-funded early childhood education programs. And this will only be exacerbated when federal relief dollars run out. So if we want to set students up for success, we have to make investments at the federal and state level and make early childhood education more affordable. And I bring all these things up to say there are systemic barriers in every dimension of resource equity that students of color are facing the moment that they enter the school building. And so knowing that, when we think about prevention, we have to think about addressing these essential parts of our school system. And we have research that shows that how students experience school is critical to their success in word recognition, language comprehension, and reading comprehension. And this includes beliefs that influence student motivation to engage in learning. So the point is that a positive school climate and a culture of belonging, high expectations from highly trained teachers in schools that serve students who need the most, have the most resources, families that are in close partners or close conversations with schools early on, right? High quality relationships in schools. All of these things enhance students' levels of motivation and promote learning. And I'll just add one more thing while I'm here that we already talked about a couple of times, but I want to emphasize is the importance of disaggregated data to inform interventions that happen before the time of retention conversations, right? Which students are given which resources, which students are given which interventions, which students are retained. We have some states that have retention policies and we don't know which students are a part of which pathway, right? Which students are attending the summer bridge camp, which students are attending the after-school tutoring camp, and what those success rates look like, right? So it's really important that we have that disaggregated data to help us better understand what's going on. And this can be used to evaluate the success of interventions, and we have to think about all of those things when we're talking about prevention.
Thank you, Kristen. And I would even add to that, ensuring that while we're disaggregating the data and we're identifying the same students in achievement gaps, the same students in overrepresentation in special ed, are the interventions that we're applying to these students? Are they the appropriate intervention for the students that we're identifying in these said achievement gaps? So I think while disaggregating the data is part one, ensuring that the interventions that are applied to those students, and you elevated culturally, having access to culturally relevant literature as a part of that in your response. But I think it's important for systems and policy all to drive around making sure that the intervention is appropriate to the students that are represented in that disaggregated data. And I will pass it over to David. We're talking about how can we mitigate the need for retention?
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that you know, in a very real way, the point of retention policies, or the goal of retention policies, is not necessarily to retain kids, right? That's certainly not the outcome that anyone is rooting for. And so, you know, you can look at it either way, right? You can say, well, I don't think retention would be effective without all these supports. And I completely agree. But you could also turn around and ask whether all of these supports would really have come into place without retention, right? One of the sort of unfortunate features, I think, of our education system and many education systems, right, is that inevitably responsibility for any single kid is distributed, right? It does not necessarily fall on any individual teacher to get that kid to point X to be the one that solves the problem. And so there's a very strong incentive to just keep pushing kids along, or you know, even if every individual person in the system is really trying their hardest to make a difference. And so I think there's something to be said for policies that incentivize the necessary focus from the system, from the relevant adults that are at some level inconvenient, because it forces people to behave differently. And that's sort of the goal at some level, right? And, you know, I think we know very little about the mechanisms through which that is happening. I mean, we can speculate, right? But I'm not going to sit here and say that the empirical literature tells us what's going on. But, you know, teachers and administrators with lots of other responsibilities, right, might pay more attention to a specific kid's reading skills if retention is on the table. Parents might focus on reading at home if they know that a kid might be retained. Parents and kids might take summer school more seriously. So I could go on, but, you know, the point being that, you know, the goal is not to retain kids. The goal is to get people's attention, right, and get them to focus on the task at hand, which is getting the kid to read. I guess I'll also just comment really briefly on the disproportionality question. You know, it's an important concern. But if the impact is positive and the policy is applied disproportionately, then the benefits flow disproportionately to the kids who are retained. So, you know, I acknowledge that these sort of policies are not implemented like they're in some sort of vacuum. There's research that shows that, you know, more educated parents are better at sort of getting their kid out of retention, right? But that's, you know, sort of unfortunate if you buy the notion that retention is actually helping some of these kids. So, you know, I think it's a tough conversation, but I don't know. I think ultimately we ought to be asking whether the policy is helping the kid or not, and that's where I start.
Thank you, David. And I will pass it over to Casey. How can we mitigate the need for retention?
Well, I think we start in kindergarten and hopefully even in pre-K. It's wonderful when states have pre-K efforts, and that certainly helps to set the stage for kids to be even more prepared by kindergarten. And I think I have a slide that can be shown here to outline some of the things that we at ExcelinEd believe should be part of a policy package that really focuses on prevention, and that would include training the teachers. We have a lot of states that have invested in science of reading training and more all the time, but that training has to be applied and made available to teachers. And really, it's even better when it's required of teachers, so that we can ensure that every child gets a teacher who's adequately prepared to deliver high quality core instruction in the classroom. Literacy or reading coaches who can help the transfer of the learning that teachers experience, and transfer the knowledge they gain from training into the classroom to practice. Aligning what we do in educator preparation programs is critical, because then we can have a prepared teacher from day one. And there are a lot of states who are seeing efforts pay off, where they're investing in reaching to that partnership level with educator preparation programs at universities. And then also looking at an assessment for licensure to ensure that teachers have learned what they need to before being licensed in a state. Universal reading screener, I mentioned that earlier, but screening kids 3 times a year with a plan to, when they are identified, a plan to put in place to address those deficiencies. We like to say not more than 15 to 30 days after those results are available. We really like to see one communication with parents, and we like to see a plan to be developed so that those students start to receive services and support so that they can make the gains that are needed. And we want that to happen in the earlier grades. There are a couple of states that have policies that they don't really provide those supports until 3rd grade or kids moving into 3rd grade. And it really needs to be proactive and begin in the earliest years of school, in kindergarten and first, and work all the way through 3rd grade. Dyslexia screening is another critical piece. And then when we think about supporting families at home, we want to be able to give them high quality resources to support their students. In Mississippi, we designed a read at home plan so that when a student was identified as having a deficiency in reading, the teacher could itemize what skills they needed support on. That report or that read at home plan could go home with the child and be made available to the parents so that they could support them in the home environment, as well as the extra supports that were being given to them in the school environment. And, you know, a lot of states have passed literacy policies, but some of those states have not yet advanced a focus on curriculum to ensure that the core curriculum that's being delivered in the classroom is high quality and that it's aligned to what evidence says is the best way to teach kids to read. And so we have to be sure that we start there, that we have high quality instruction in the classroom, and that we're eliminating materials that may include flawed practices like 3Qing and things that have shown not to be to students' benefit long term. And then we look at intervention, and you can see here listed those individual reading plans, evidence-based interventions, summer reading camps, and before, during, and after school interventions can be made available. But as we talked about, that retention year would just be another part of the intervention if all of these other things did not prove to be successful. And in so many cases, they do. But when they haven't, it's harmful to students to continue to promote them and put them in a situation where they're going to struggle more. So while the retention year may be one that is up for debate, when it's done the right way with a supportive, preventative approach in practice, then that's when we see the studies are showing the positive effects of it and that it can help students catch up before moving on.
Thank you, Casey, for sharing this wide range of preventative and intervention strategies to mitigate the need for retention. I want to ask you a follow-up question around this concept of fidelity versus integrity, right? All of these various prevention strategies require some level of fidelity or integrity as we frame that. So I just want to hear a little bit more of your thoughts around the fidelity and integrity piece to these various approaches.
I think fidelity is critical. We have to use fidelity in our instructional methods, along with our core curriculum, with our interventions. When we identify those that are evidence-based, we want to be sure that we're teaching them with fidelity. And then certainly when we think about how we support families and that intervention process, an intervention that brings a student in and walks them through 12 to 16 weeks of a rote process that is delivered to every kid is not an effective intervention if it doesn't target their specific needs. So we have to be sure that those things are done to fidelity and planning, and that we plan that with a sense of integrity so that we're ensuring that the time that we spend with children is targeted, that it's intentional, and that we're filling the gaps that we identify through screening. So I think that the integrity and fidelity play a huge role in all of those steps. And you know, we can explore them further in each of those categories, but that's an important point to bring up. To check a box and say that we're doing something is not the same as doing it to fidelity and with a high level of integrity. And that's where we see the great impact of those preventative and intervention resources.
Thank you, Casey. And Adrian, I'm going to add you in on this question as well. How can we mitigate the need for retention?
Yeah, I certainly would agree with what my colleagues have said around implementing a system of prevention, assessment, and intervention to provide students with the supports that they need before retention even becomes part of the conversation. And part of that requires time and patience and continuous evaluation in the policy development process, which is never easy. But until those supports are in place and fully implemented with fidelity, to your point, Dr. Nye, a retention policy likely won't have the intended effect of bringing students up to grade level. And some states have taken steps to ensure that local districts have at least the financial and human resources to provide those supports, whether that's through a supplemental per pupil funding amount or grant programs. And then I also wanted to just touch on, I know this is going to be the focus of the webinar next week, but as Casey mentioned, policymakers are also looking for ways to strengthen their pre-kindergarten systems and build foundational skills before students arrive in the classroom, whether those experiences are taking place in family, friend, and neighbor care, or center-based care, or Head Start, or state pre-K. High quality care and education, along with intentional alignment in the early elementary grades, has the potential to improve school readiness and reduce the need for retention later.
Thank you so much, Adrian. I'm going to hop right into our last question because we're getting close to time. And I know there are several questions that are coming in on the Q&A. So this question focuses on effective parent engagement. And what does that look like in policy and practice? As a mom that is heavily engaged in this work as a parent and have had many battles with school leaders and teachers around what works best for my own child, I would love to hear how we elevate that and what does effective parent engagement look like in policy and practice. I am starting with Casey.
Great. Thank you so much. I'd love to talk a little bit about the importance and the impact that it can have, because parent and family engagement is critical. And I don't think it just stops with the parents. It really should be family engagement, and families can look different in different settings, but opportunities to engage the family in literacy learning events. One of the things that we did in Mississippi that had a tremendous payoff is to host family nights around the state. We literally traveled like a road show and had events in person in multiple places around the state. And then we also responded to requests when specific schools, districts, and sometimes even church groups or community groups would reach out and ask. We would send a literacy coach or a team, and we engaged with families in these environments where we talked about the law. We, especially in the early years of the law, we had so much knowledge to build around what the policy said and how we could be be proactive in addressing that so that students wouldn't come to a point when they would need to be retained. So talking through what the law means, how does it get enacted? Like, what do we do to help students be as successful as they can in school? And then giving them strategies. An important part of that night was to actually share strategies that families could use in their homes and to support their students. I think also that read at home plan I mentioned earlier, it was crafted for the teacher to be able to specifically itemize and to identify the things that the students needed to work on so that families could be supported with targeted information. And the more high quality, the better. North Carolina developed in the last couple of years a digital literacy initiative that's online and made available for families. There are other states who have invested in or are continuing to invest in resources to support families and their students so that they can have everything that they need to be a successful reader and on the right track for reading development. So I think those pieces are critical. And then also the way that we communicate with parents about how kids are doing. Report cards are just not always as reliable as we would like for them to be when we look at how a student is performing in reading. There's so many things that go into the score, the letter grade that students get, that it's just not always as true a picture or reflection as we might want it to be. And so when we can complete those universal screenings or a dyslexia screening, whatever the approach may be, being able to communicate with parents in a timely fashion is critical so that we let them know as soon as possible, not only that there's an issue where their student needs support, but how we are going to support them, and that we outline what steps we will take and what supports will be made available to them. And then a number of other things that schools do is to actually bring families in for family event nights where they actually do literacy activities with families, and that benefits not only the child who's in the learning process at the moment, but the family, and then often siblings who may be coming behind them or also be in a situation where they are able to learn and to benefit from the supports that provides as well. So there's so many ways that we can effectively engage parents and families, and we just have to be intentional and I think have a strategic approach to how we do it.
Thank you so much, Casey. And now I'm going to pass it over to Kristen.
Yes, full cosign on everything Casey said. And we look at it from a district level, and local school districts need to work really carefully with families on reading supports and share what services are available, because not all parents or families are able to navigate those services again in the same way. And all of that is happening before a child may hit the kindergarten door. So at my organization, we talk a lot about information sharing early and often in different formats and guaranteed in families' home languages. So I know Casey mentioned things like different events, evening events, school events, events where you can bring your other children. So maybe that may mitigate the need for childcare. All of those things are really important. And I also want to add in, those are really important that districts are communicating and partnering with families to make decisions about retention and promotion options, including sending out really clear information about the retention appeals process. So again, this is really important when we look at the findings from Michigan, which suggested better resourced parents and families were more likely to advocate for promotion. So let's not reserve that option only for parents with a particular know-how or with strong relationships with schools. And I say that because earlier this year, we did a survey with parents of first graders, and we'll be releasing our findings in our upcoming report. But we found that parents are feeling disconnected from their child's school, and they say that they want to connect more, but there are major barriers to entry, including scheduling conflicts, transportation, childcare needs, and even really notably, half of parents said they felt unwelcomed by other parents. So if that's the situation, right, that may be a huge barrier in the way of parents coming to those event nights, or right, or being able to concentrate on hearing what services are available. And parents say they want more information from their schools earlier, before a crisis or before a big decision. And just about half of parents said they were aware of information available to them on whether their student met grade level expectations. So Casey highlighted the point that, a grade may not always reflect, the report card may not always reflect crucial information. Parents may not have a sense of how their child really is, or if they may be struggling. And we also found that opportunities like parent information hotlines in multiple languages, data nights, or resources and trainings for at-home academic support were available to less than a quarter of parents in our sample, and were attended by fewer than 10% of parents. So even we know that schools and districts may have a lot of opportunities, but if parents don't know that they exist or aren't attending them, that's a huge issue, right? And even really low bars, like a third of our parent respondents were not aware of the opportunity for parent-teacher conferences at their schools, right? So again, we know that parents and educators are eager to participate and engage with each other in their school community, but school leaders have to make sure that they're thinking about how they can minimize those families' barriers to engagement, even if they have great things in place to engage with families. If there are barriers in place, right, they need to consider if their regular communication with families is working, and ensure that their school is welcoming to all parents.
Thank you, Kristen. I'm going to pass it over to you, Adrian.
Yeah, I'll just briefly speak to what we see in policy. In our 50-state comparison, we found that at least 24 states require parental engagement in the retention process. Now, some of those policies may focus more on the notification and transparency aspect than engagement, but we are seeing more states that are requiring parents to be notified earlier in the process when a student is identified as reading below grade level, and to be included in the development of intervention strategies or individual reading plans. And to Kristen's point, some states also have policies in place to make the process for appealing a retention decision or applying for a good cause exemption more transparent and accessible for families, to try to mitigate the potential for inequitable application of those retention policies.
And I also want to elevate back to something Kristen talked about, making sure that we're sharing information early and often in families' home language. That's something that we just can't underscore in the parent engagement realm, is that parents have to be able to be engaged in their home language. And I think that districts across the country are finding that that is an area that we really have to ensure that we are giving information in families' home language. So thank you for elevating that, Kristen. I want to underscore that. And then I'll pass it over to David. What does effective parent engagement look like in policy and practice? David, unmute.
Sorry about that. I'm always nervous of coughing or sneezing while other people are talking. I was going to say, I don't know how much I can add in terms bring to the table in terms of real world perspective, but I do know that we've known for a long time through the work of Learning Heroes and some other organizations that this is a challenge because teachers don't particularly want to tell parents that their kids are below grade level, and parents don't particularly want to hear it. And so, I think part of the reason we have these policies, or part of the reason that they've been tried, is because this is sort of an enduring challenge. It's a hard conversation. And so I think that's one way of understanding the reason for the policy in many of these places. And I think the policy gives people sort of a jumping off point for the conversation that maybe wouldn't exist otherwise. So that's my only real comment on it, is that, it's not an easy conversation, but it's a necessary conversation, and it's not a conversation that always happens. So that's my only comment.
Thank you, David. And I'll just also add, beyond sharing with parents reading grade levels, we really emphasize areas of needs based on a comprehensive reading assessment to really help families understand the particular areas beyond just the child is reading on or off grade level, and really looking at the particular areas that students may be having difficulty, and then ensuring that the appropriate interventions are applied to those areas. So definitely taking it a step further with helping families understand the comprehensive or the barrier of assessment that are being administered to children is really critical in the conversations with parents as well. I'm going to open it up to, first of all, I want to thank our amazing panel for bringing these wide range of perspectives with research, policy, practices, and also I emphasizing that equity base in this conversation, and really trying to center understanding around how this is really impacting students. And one of the questions that came up in that vein of equity, and it was answered in the chat, but I really want to elevate this, are more boys retained than girls? Considering the difference in maturity and gender levels. Does anyone else have any insight? Kristen, I know you answered that in the chat, but do you want to give some voice to that, or anyone else have seen anything in policy or in research that would give insight around this particular question?
I saw that and I'm struggling to answer it. I don't remember seeing a lot of it in the studies. My guess is the answer is yes. But someone else may be able to bring hard data to that.
In case anyone didn't see, I did respond that we have data from Michigan that shows that boys were retained at a slightly higher rate, about a 1 or 2 percentage point difference. So, you know, whether that's a big deal or not, but I can add that in.
Thank you, Kristen. I will go to another question. Lisa White wrote in the chat, is that data before or after COVID? But I'm not quite sure which data she's referencing in that question. So Lisa, if you're still on, if you could, Becky, do you know which data she's referencing?
I think that came in around the time that David was talking about their research. So it might be the...
Yeah, I think the vast majority of studies are from before COVID. I think this issue is obviously at the forefront of many people's minds because it's just heightened the stakes of the question, having so many kids who are behind grade level.
Thank you, David. I'm going to go to this question from Kevin Scott. What does the data show regarding the graduation rates for students who were retained compared to those who were not? Also, what did the data highlight as the missing link? In essence, how or why was retention beneficial the second time opposed to during the first academic year? And then the last question, definitely define the causal piece of retention. I think we touched on that, but if anyone else wants to elevate anything in particular to this question. Graduation rates for students who were retained compared to those who were not.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of evidence that shows that there's much of an impact on graduation rates. The high school outcomes that are impacted tend to be things like credit accumulation, which, you know, you can accumulate more credits and still not graduate, or you know, the types of courses you take, your grades. I don't think there's a lot of evidence that suggests early grade retention has much of an impact one way or the other. I guess I'll also say there's a long lag time between 3rd grade and 12th grade. So almost no policy that I can think of reliably impacts 12th grade if it's implemented in 3rd grade.
I can offer that in regard to Mississippi, the first group of students who would have been retained would have been in the 2014-15 school year. So those students haven't yet graduated. So we aren't sure yet, but we hope there'll be a study to find out.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to go to this question from Shelley. I heard about Hispanics and African Americans benefiting from early retention with plans for specific interventions the following year. I'd like to hear more about how retention pertains to our multilingual learners.
I can jump in and add that we've collected some information on how retention impacts English learners, including that Latino English learners who are held back in early grades may be less engaged in instruction, receive less teacher support, and have lower literacy skills. So we have some more concerning, I would say, data around English learners, and there's a lot going on when we talk about retaining English learners. A lot of states have different exceptions for different levels of English learning, right? But yeah, our research that we have shows that grade retention disproportionately impacts Black, Latino, Native students, and English learners. And we would want to make sure that there are targeted supports for those students so they're not disproportionately experiencing the negative impacts that we found, like lower engagement, negative social and emotional experiences in their schools.
Thank you. I have another question from Jessica. Has any research included measures of other policies, such as teacher reading certifications, tier 2, tier 3 interventions, science of reading curriculum and instruction, alongside measuring retention policies?
I think one of the challenges in measuring is that in many places, these are comprehensive packages or policy packages that have a multitude of components. And so it's really hard to pull one out. Retention is a little easier to look more closely at because you can identify those students who were retained, the students who got the intervention services, or whether they got intervention during school, whether they also got summer programming, whether they were identified. There's so many components of that I think it makes it hard. I wouldn't think that it makes it impossible, but I'm not aware of studies that have looked more closely at those individual components of a policy. David might be able to speak to more than I can.
No, I was going to say the same thing. It always seems to be tightly packaged, and so it's very hard to distinguish what's driving the effect, if there is one. Which is frustrating. In case it's not clear, it's frustrating.
I would concur with that. We often get asked about like the impact of literacy coaches or the impact of teacher training. It would be wonderful if we could measure each piece and look at the effect size individually. We just haven't, I'm not familiar with a researcher who's found a way to do that yet.
I have another question coming in here by Surinder. That is there specific funding, federal or state, made available to address retention?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any funding streams that are specific to retention. Generally speaking, when a student is retained, they are just treated as a pupil again, which means that they will then be funded as a regular pupil under whatever the foundation formula or however the state funds that particular student. There are certainly states that have taken steps to provide specific funding streams for interventions, whether that means for students who are retained or students who are not retained, but who are exhibiting reading difficulties, who are not reading at grade level.
I'll just jump in and add that, again, sometimes they're not always the required interventions or suggested interventions for students who may be struggling or who may be retained are always funded at the state level. So often, districts may need to be pulling funding from other essential education priorities. So that is an issue as well. Like if we know that retention can be successful when there are really strong supports in place, but those supports are not always funded, that's a concern.
I have a question in here from Dr. Bivens. I think we talked about this, but I'll elevate this. As I understand, the study suggests that subsequent performance of students who are just below the level at which they would be required to be retained is negatively affected. This may suggest that in at least some of the cases, voluntary retention might be desirable. In turn, consequent increases in the number of students subject to voluntary retention might diminish the negative effects of mandatory retention on those who are subject to that. At the same time, the effects of both mandatory and voluntary retention on perception and motivation may be counteracted somewhat by apparently increased commitment of retained students to school, student body, and teachers, and by their improved performance generally. Is there any research to support this query? So basically looking at the differences between mandatory and voluntary retention on self-perception and motivation.
So I think we know almost nothing about the effects of, sorry to play the role of like sort of nerdy researcher, but I really think we know almost nothing about the effects of ad hoc voluntary retention, right? The fact that people are making these sort of non-random decisions around it makes it really hard to study. I have an open mind about when it comes to the amount of discretion that should be involved in these decisions, right? I mean, parents and teachers have insights into kids that do not show up in a test score, right? And so, it may make sense to retain a kid or not, based on things that they know. At the same time, the sort of, there's two different kinds of disproportionality, right? But the kind that's been alluded to where, the policy is actually being implemented in a way that is, leads to different outcomes for kids with the same test scores. That's an inevitable risk if once you allow for discretion. So I don't know. I think it's hard to decouple those two things. But I certainly don't think the research gives any definitive answer about how much discretion should be given.
I'm going to jump into this question. Considering using artificial intelligence to customize supports for kids and families to leverage school resources, anything around the research or policy area that you all may be able to contribute to a response to that?
It's certainly being talked a lot about on the state level in terms of policy, but no one has really figured out how to craft a policy, especially at the state level. I know a lot of these tools are already being used in some classrooms, but I think at the state level anyway, folks are still trying to wrap their brains around what can and should be in policy around this in order to protect student privacy, avoid, unintended biases, things like that. And I think that's going to be developing for the next couple of years.
I think a precondition for any sort of positive effect is you got to have, I don't know, motivation is really important, right? So my sense is that motivated kids will be able to take advantage of these sorts of tools. But if the other things you're trying with the kid aren't working, I really doubt that AI is the solution.
I'll drop a link in the chat box. I know that one of my colleagues who works in digital literacy policies at ExcelinEd has created a model policy around AI. I don't think that it reaches to the point that you're outlining, but it at least will maybe give you a starting point to look at some of the things that are coming out or around policy and AI.
I will add that my daughter had access to AI intervention on computer, and I've given several feedback to the creator of this AI, which is always great as a mom that you can find the person that created the thing. But there were definitely kinks and bugs with that particular AI where I had to make a lot of corrections where the AI was making incorrect understanding of her speech and what she was saying. The corrections were sometimes off and not always giving her the tools that she needed to address the particular need that she was experiencing. So I found that I had to do a lot of engagement with the AI to ensure that there weren't unintentional errors being created by the artificial intelligence. I think there's just always that need for human interaction to ensure that what is being provided does actually provide the intervention and not also relieving the human responsibility. I know this was something that we used at home, but I would have hated to hear that this AI was in place of actual intervention supports that my daughter actually required, and someone was just placing her on the computer to do an intervention with AI without really having any adult engaging in that platform or monitoring her use of that. We just had a poll dropped in. So Becca, you want us to give time for folks to complete the poll?
Yes, please do the poll, and we'll keep our conversation going. Answer a few more questions in Q&A. So do take time to fill out that poll, and be sure and scroll down to get to all the questions. We use that information; it's very helpful for us. I saw there was a question, Dr. Nye, about research specific to retention in kindergarten and long-term outcomes. Anyone have a response to that?
Without seeing the exact question, I'll just say one of the more interesting responses that we got to our Think Again was a column that essentially said third grade's too late. And I think a lot of the comments have kind of echoed that sentiment. And I think most of us are saying that ideally, you know, the policy pushes people to intervene sooner, right, in anticipation of it. But I'll just say, you know, I mean, I think we all recognize there's something a little arbitrary about the fact that we start testing in third grade, right? It's just kind of how we do it. And so, you know, it's entirely, I can't speak to research that doesn't exist, but it's entirely possible that if it works better in third grade than it does in sixth grade, that it works better in first grade than it does in third grade. I don't know that, but it's not a crazy idea. So I kind of hope, you know, that a state tries it in kindergarten. I don't know what would happen, but it's possible that, you know, it's a bigger win, right? Or that the effects are more unambiguously positive, right? And so, yeah, I think it's intuitive, right, to many of us that third grade is really late. I have a 3-year-old. It's 5 years from now, right? It's a long time to not be learning to read. So my personal opinion is that it should be tried.
I think one of the challenges for a lot of states around kindergarten is that kindergarten isn't mandatory in many states. And so it makes it hard to study something that the first time wouldn't be mandatory. And so for some of those states where they don't have mandatory kindergarten, the idea of holding students back, they need a parent to agree, since it wasn't mandatory in the first place, and they could technically just begin school at first grade. So you do have a little bit of a push and pull tension on that issue, I would suppose. I will say that from the work in Mississippi, we did see some schools start to retain kids earlier than third grade. Where we were slightly concerned was when they would set a universal screener scale score threshold that they would use it as a determinant, because that's not how universal screeners are designed. They're not meant to be a summative measure. And so that's where it got to be a little bit of a struggle when we would work with districts to, you know, be able to look at student data. In the screener data, universal screener data is really more intended to drive instruction, to address the needs of students, and it doesn't necessarily measure summatively all that they should have learned in the time that they've been in school.
Thank you, Casey. There's a question in here, not sure how related, but just in thinking about being knowledgeable and informed about adverse childhood events and how that plays into this. Any research or any thoughts or policies that have been informed around adverse childhood events in regards to retention? It's kind of like another variable that could be added to think about.
I think that when we think about those earliest grades, like, we really have to think about how we're supporting kids instructionally. And when we use those screeners and we identify them early, then we can target interventions to support them early rather than waiting until they get through. But developmental things, I've seen kindergarten students change drastically from the time that they started school and even until mid-year. Sometimes just teaching them to sit as part of a group and participate in the classroom can look so different at the beginning of the year than the things that we experience in the latter part of the year. So I just would reflect on the fact that there's so many ways that we can support kids without retention in those earliest years before we really see if they need it. So what we saw were elements of discretionary application where they identified students who might need it. But as far as a policy that reaches across a grade level with an assessment approach, third grade, I think, is really identified because that's the year that we think of instruction changing. Instruction in K-3 targets building reading development, teaching kids how to be good readers. But after that, in moving on to fourth grade, third grade is really when we start to look for them to read for learning purposes, and they're not being taught reading skills and development as explicitly and systematically. They're moving more to learning from the text themselves, and that continues on into the upper grades. So it gets a little more challenging to develop those early reading foundational skills if we allow them to move on without the support of a teacher who may have been trained in those things.
If I could just jump in and add, if we're talking about young people who have experienced trauma, I think that just leads to, again, the real importance of a feeling of belonging in the classroom and a feeling like students have strong relationships with adults in their schools and their teacher in particular. And that's just, of course, but I think that that's really important, right? And again, I think about some of the potential risks of retention, which may include, a feeling like they don't belong in their school or their classroom. I just think that that's the best case scenario, is having students feel like their classroom is somewhere where they're welcome and they belong and their teacher cares about them.
Thank you, Kristen, for adding that. I will also uplift a comment in the chat where it says some students need strong tier 1 instruction. So just retaining for retention's sake in kindergarten is counterproductive, especially if they do not attend pre-K. Are there any other questions?
Well, Dr. Nye, I'd like to jump in and take a moment here to thank everyone, to thank all of our panelists, Adrian and Kristen, David, Casey, to everyone who joined today for your thoughtful comments and questions. This has been really an extraordinary conversation. I have learned a lot myself, and that's one of the things I love about being part of the webinar team here at the campaign. And Dr. Nye, special thanks to you for joining us, for bringing your perspective as an educator, a leader, and as a mom to this conversation today, and for your thoughtful moderation. So we hope you will join us next week, all of you in the audience, to learn more about Mississippi. And we have all these tremendous upcoming webinars. So thank you for being here. Thanks again to our panelists. Thanks, Sierra, for your good work in the background. And we will see you all very soon.